It's all good. Yeah, I am professor of sociology and women and gender studies at the Community College of Denver. I am the Healthy Communities Chair for this community advisory group. Essentially, just really connecting the community with our work, and then also just really intentionally collaborating with other organizations, and because we all know there's plenty of work to do, so we all kind of need to be all hands on deck on all of this work. So I appreciate everyone that's here tonight and giving us your time. We have a great evening planned. Our guest, Dr. Lamphere, he was here before the show, so long ago, before the pandemic. He had visited us and really welcomed by the community. And Dr. Lamphere answers questions from the community. He's very approachable, and I really appreciate you being here tonight to clear some of this stuff up. And the science, and we know that science is really just, there's a lot of people that want to yell fake, but I will say that if you listen to Dr. Lamphere, that by the end of it, you don't feel like it's so fake. So, but that we're fake busting right now, and we appreciate you. So let's move on. So one of our members, one of our scientists and experts, Chuck Norris, he has some comments for us, and what I will do, we'll have him make comment until around 5:55, so that we can leave questions for him at the end, so that if you have questions for him, you can put those out to him. You can also put any questions you have in the chat. So, and everybody should at this point make sure that you keep your laptop, your computers on mute. So then, I have a dog that really drinks water, and it sounds like, I don't know, like a whole piping system going on behind me. So please mute, so that we can all kind of be respectful and hear what people are saying. So with that, all questions can go in the chat. So let's give Chuck the opportunity to finish his comments, and then we can ask questions instead of sort of the back and forth at this point. And then again with Dr. Lamphere, we'll do the same thing. And then we'll have the back and forth at the end. Again, I'll kind of be looking out for questions in the chat, and I'll keep those open. So then folks can, I'll remind the speaker to answer those questions. Dennis is doing a great job. Thank you so much, Dennis, at putting his email and his name in the chat. So please, if you are here, so that we can put you down for attendance, make sure you put that information in the chat, and we can get you registered that you were here and scheduled. So that's about it. Let's learn some stuff. Chuck, are you ready to go?
I'm ready to go.
Cool, thank you. Go ahead.
By way of update on my CAG-related activities, I've continued to investigate the waste and/or toxic materials that have been generated within, stored on, or disposed at, and transported from the areas that have variously been designated through time as Operable Unit 2 at the Vasquez Boulevard and I-70 Superfund site. For those of you not familiar with where OU2 is, it's a area that is sort of centered on the parking lots south and west of the Denver Coliseum and the Globeville Landing Park. So that's where this area is. This investigation area, or investigating this area, is pretty slow work, and it is at times pretty tedious. It's also very complicated. It's a site that has generated, received, and/or exported wastes or toxic materials for some 150 years, virtually a time period that covers all major industrial areas from the late 19th century through the 20th century and into the 21st century. So you're looking at an industrial history that includes metal refinement, chemicals, fossil fuels, and radiological and nuclear eras in American industry, all of which need to be considered with respect to this particular site. Once I can get a grasp on the history and the associated toxic material streams as they can be identified associated with this site, I'll start structuring what I refer to as my ghost remedial investigation, so that I can offer the CAG something to compare to what will be coming out of the city and county of Denver by way of EPA. So that work is continuing at this point in the absence of my having an opportunity to review anything that any of the agencies are working on. That's really my CAG related work, but there are a couple of other items that have come to my attention since the last CAG meeting that I wanted to bring up. One is a letter that I received on July 10th through Bridget that I had an opportunity to review. It's a July 9th letter from EPA to Bridget. EPA's letter was written in response to a broad-ranging letter to them from Bridget using her personal email account, and she did identify herself as a CAG member. Bridget discussed a number of issues related to the EPA CAG and resident relationships related to EPA's performance at the Superfund site and with respect to the CAG. EPA's letter saddened me. It didn't surprise me, but it did sadden me. As I interpret the letter, it was considered an opportunity to make it clear to Bridget, and presumably through Bridget to the CAG, what she and therefore the CAG can expect from EPA, and what they can expect from EPA appears to be what they have gotten from the EPA for the last 2 years. It does not appear to suggest anything that will improve cooperative attempts and efforts to assess and remediate the contamination, even within the Superfund site, let alone considering whether that Superfund site is adequate to deal with the problems at GES. The first paragraph actually professes EPA's pride in how they have behaved in the past. The bulk of the rest of the letter uses the same brush and the same pastel colors to describe once again how they want the public to perceive those activities and how to perceive what they purport to have accomplished. I do wish that EPA's picture were accurate, but it isn't. And as again described in that letter, it borders on obfuscation. Particularly disheartening to me is EPA's lead paragraph to Bridget under the category of CAG meetings. Paraphrase, it's, so you're unhappy with how we deal with the CAG. In a nutshell, tough to live with it. To quote specifically, while we understand that you may not have always agreed with the responses given by or decisions made by EPA personnel, our goal is to provide that information in a meaningful and respectful manner and ensure that our communications remain productive. I urge the CAG to continue to stew and to protest and object to the way EPA has been treating it and how it has been responding to EPA's or to the CAG's attempt to serve its statutory and regulatory role, not as just a provider of public comment, but as an advisor to the EPA. It needs to continue to worry its pretty little head about what is happening compared to what should be happening, and to draw attention to what has been done as opposed to the way what has been done is being described. I urge you to continue to try and get EPA responses and responsiveness in writing when something is amiss. But it's clear that is not their intent. Unfortunately, your work remains cut out for you. One of the issues that Bridget brought up was the issue of racism and or how that intersects with social justice or environmental justice. Bridget accused no one, and I don't feel that anyone is being accused of deliberate racism. But that doesn't mean that the process is clean of it. I have worked on 2 neighborhood Superfund sites, both in the same time frame, that had remarkable similarities in contaminants that were being assessed, in the industry origin of those contaminants, the incomes of the neighborhoods, the style and density of housing, the ages of the neighborhoods, the location of the neighborhoods relative to industry, major roads, rail lines, just almost lay down comparisons. The outcomes or the assessments making it to the rod are that the residual levels of lead and arsenic deemed to be below unacceptable risk at GES triggered emergency removal response at the other site. The difference between the two, the most obvious 2 differences that I can see, is they were in different EPA regions, and there is a difference in the skin color and nations of origin of the residents. EPA, I urge you, don't dismiss these concerns. Be uncomfortable about them, accept that discomfort, and make sure that what has been done in the past and is being done in the past is consistent with what is being done elsewhere in the country in comparable settings. So that's one set of comments I wanted to make. The other one came up, and there isn't much to comment on about it, but many of you may have seen that Pepsi is selling their facilities in Operable Unit 2. My guess will be that is going to precipitate a lot of changes in how City and County of Denver wants to deal with OU2, changes that it will discuss with and present to EPA and CDPHE, but probably not the CAG, unless the CAG can get the other agencies to involve it. But I am quite certain, based upon my experience in Denver, that City and County of Denver is going to quickly change OU2 to move the Pepsi property out of it and deal with the contamination of that site as it has been characterized so far, and the portions of it that have not been characterized because they're under the footprint of the building, moved that to the voluntary cleanup program and out of the Superfund program in order to eliminate, to a very great extent, any public process associated with the cleanup and the declaration that the property is ready for redevelopment. I don't think that should be possible to do. I don't think it's right to do it, but I do expect that effort to be made, and everybody in the CAG needs to watch every newspaper, every source they have of what's going on environmentally in Denver and report it among other members of the CAG as soon as they hear about it. So that's my update and my two comments. I've probably exceeded the window I had, but if there are questions, if there are time for questions, and if someone can read me any questions that are in writing, I will answer.
I think we have time for one question, if anybody has one, and then we'll have Adrian introduce Dr. Lamphere. Any questions? I don't see any in the chat. Yeah, go ahead, Joan. And we could get that information for you, Weston. Go ahead, Joan.
Can you unmute yourself when you want to chat?
Hi,
Hello?
sorry about that.
Hello,
Thank you.
Dr.
Can you hear me? Are you able
Yes.
to hear me now? Chuck, thank you very much for that thorough assessment. Pepsi, when Pepsi decided to not lease the property anymore that they're on, they bought the property from Denver, and that happened a couple of months just before it became a Superfund site, the Operable Unit 2. So Chuck, you're right, it will be interesting because there was serious contamination under Pepsi, and that Denver does a lot of let's build on top instead of clean it up. It's a lot cheaper. So I'll be looking forward to the proposal to move Pepsi or get Pepsi to really talk about what's under their property.
Thanks, Joan. And then Chuck, do you want to briefly just, somebody put in the chat about which other Superfunds or other community advisory groups that you've actually visited?
The other site was the Town of Pines site in northern Indiana, just south of Lake Michigan. My company was contracted to serve as a TAP consultant on that Superfund site.
Thank you for that. All right, Adrian, take it away.
Okay, good evening, everyone. We're really excited to have Dr. Bruce Lamphere here this evening. Dr. Lamphere received his MD degree at the University of Missouri in Kansas and also his MPH at Tulane School of Public Health, the Tropical Medicine. His areas of research and I hope I get this right because I know it's pretty extensive. Fetal and early childhood exposure to environmental neurotoxins, including lead, pesticides, mercury, and other heavy metals, also including alcohol. So, Dr. Lamphere, when you're ready, and unmute yourself too.
Yes. All right. Thank you, Adrian, and thank you, Chuck. A lot of what I have to say is going to be generic, and so it's always good to have people like Chuck as well as yourselves, because all of you have developed expertise from all the work you've done in your own community, and no matter how good our regulating agencies are, what unfortunately happens is things really only take place when the community gets involved. That may not be what most of us expected. It certainly isn't what I expected when I started to do science. I thought things would happen when the science was done, but it takes more than that. So what I wanted to talk about today, and while I'm doing this, let me just make sure I can share my screen, and I can. What I wanted to talk about today is something that's very relevant to all the work you're doing and some of the concerns you have. And that is this question about, are there safe levels? And are the levels that the regulators use, that the EPA or the FDA or other agencies use, are they protective? And probably like most of you, when I started to do science, when I was trained in medicine, I was taught that many of the chemicals that we're exposed to, the metals, the pesticides, that there were safe levels or thresholds below which there were no harms. And I think for the most part, that's still true today, at least for the non-carcinogens. For cancer-causing agents or carcinogens, the assumption is made that there is no threshold, but there's a linear relationship. And we'll talk more about that. And some of what I'll talk about is to use some jargony terms, but I think that's important because even though the evidence showing that there are no safe levels or no thresholds for many of the most well-studied toxic chemicals and pollutants, and it's growing, there still is there's an inertia to acknowledging that. There's a flawed mandate and inadequate laws that keep us from acting on that new evidence. So I wanted to start out with a study that I think I showed you last year. And last year when I came to Denver, that was my last trip out of the province of British Columbia before the pandemic kind of closed everything down. One of the studies that really blew my mind is this study out of Scotland, but it's been replicated elsewhere. And what they found is, following the ban on smoking in public places, they found a 15% reduction in preterm birth among non-smoking women. So think about that for a minute. Secondhand smoke, reducing secondhand smoke led to a 15% reduction in preterm birth. It also led to a 25% reduction in very preterm birth. That means children born before 34 weeks gestation. That size of that reduction is better than any drug we have for preterm birth. Preterm birth today is epidemic, and it's higher in the United States than in any other comparable affluent country. All of the attention is focused on finding medicines, just like most everything else that's being done in the United States. And most physicians that I talk to are completely ignorant of studies like this that show dramatic benefit by reducing widespread exposure to toxic chemicals, in this case, secondhand smoke. And so part of what needs to happen is better recognition and acknowledgement of these studies, and an openness to begin to think about prevention, as well as to continue to focus on this, what appears to be a never-ending search for cures. So we're going to start with an XY graph. This is what's one of the favorite types of tools that scientists use. On the Y-axis over here, you can see one type of ruler looks at children's reading scores. On the X-axis here, you can see that it's representing increasing levels of lead in blood. And here, this line is just basically saying as blood lead levels increase, you see a decline in children's reading abilities. But the shape of this line is really important. If there were safe levels, can you all see my cursor, my little arrow? Nice. If there were safe levels or a threshold, you'd see a line that goes straight, right? As blood lead levels increase, no change in IQ, or excuse me, reading, right? That would be an indication that there are safe levels or thresholds. But we don't see that. What we see is an immediate and really steep decrement in children's reading abilities as blood lead levels increase. And even at these extraordinarily low concentrations, we see this steep decrement. Now we'll come back and I'll just illustrate this a different way, but I'm going to keep going for a moment. When I first saw this, this is about the year 2000, because I was so well versed, so well trained in this idea that there were safe levels, it kind of went right over my head. But then we saw the same thing in a prospective study where we had followed the children out since infancy. And here again on the Y-axis, now we're looking at the Stanford Binet Intelligence Test, which is like an IQ score. And here the same thing, we're looking at blood leads. And as blood lead levels increase, we see this steep decrement. Now this is on a little different scale, but you can see on average, we see a decrement in children's intellectual abilities from, this is about 97 or 98. And by 10 microgram per deciliter, it's already down, it's about 7 points lower, just in that range right here. And then it continues to decline, but it's attenuated. It doesn't decline as quickly. This idea that you're going to see the greatest decrements in IQ is kind of counterintuitive, right? You think high exposures, worse problems. Well, that's true, but we expect, most of us have been trained to think linearly. A certain increase results in a certain decrement. Another increase results in the same decrement, but that's not what we saw here. We saw these steeper decrements in IQ at the lowest measurable levels. So here we put together, with the help of my brother, an animation to try to get across this point. So I'll just play it real quickly. The largest drop in IQ from lead exposure occurs at the lowest. How's the volume? That's good. Okay, well, let me turn it up just a little bit because I couldn't hear it very well. Levels. As the level of lead in children's blood increases from 0 to 100 parts per billion, IQ scores drop by about 6 points. In contrast, an increase from 100 to 200 parts per billion results in an IQ drop of 2 more points. An increase from 200 to 300 parts per billion results in an IQ drop of another point. In fact, the World Health Organization and other agencies agree there is no safe level of lead exposure. So in that case, what we used is parts per billion. And so we converted it because parts per billion is a little bit easier to get your head around. 1 part per billion is equal to about 2 tablespoons of sugar in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. And 10 micrograms per deciliter is equivalent to about 100 parts per billion, just so you kind of have a range. basically with lead, you can just add a 0. So 1 microgram per deciliter is 10 parts per billion. So what we see with these is that as the exposure increases, like with lead, you see a sharp decrement. We call this a decelerating dose response or exposure response curve. And it's called decelerating because it starts out really quickly and then it slows down. So it's just a scientific way to describe the shape of the curve. It's a pretty simple concept. And what we're talking about is the exposure response curve, or if we have a measure of the exposure in blood, for example, then it can be the dose response curve. That's pretty straightforward. Now, what I wanted to show you was what happened when we did a pooled analysis. We brought together 7 different studies, and looking at each one of them made people think that there was something wrong with the studies, because in some cases they saw a steep decrement in intellectual abilities and IQ scores. In others, it was very gradual and almost flat. And what we saw here in the pooled analysis by pooling these studies together was really quite revealing. So let me just show you, and then we can maybe go back and look at it again if we want. These 7 studies from around the world, when we pooled them, what we saw was what previously looked like differences in the dose response relationship, and the shape of those curves turned out to be simply a function of where the exposures occurred. So let's come back here for a minute. In Rochester and in Boston, we saw very steep decrements in children's intellectual abilities, much steeper than Yugoslavia and Cincinnati. Well, why? What we realized by pooling these studies is that the steeper decrements were essentially those decrements that happened for children at very low levels. And this now has been replicated over a dozen times in other studies showing that this is a steep decrement, whether it's in academic abilities or in IQ scores. So no safe level, and proportionately, or for a given exposure, greater decrements in IQs at the lowest levels. Now, why does that matter? Well, this is something I showed you last year, but I'm going to show you just a little snippet of it, not the whole video, to just remind you about why these little shifts in children's IQ matter so much. Most of us have IQ scores that fall somewhere between 85 and 115 points. Only 2.5% of children have an IQ above 130, which is considered gifted. There are about 6 million children in this group. On the other end of the curve, another 2.5% of children have an IQ below 70, which is considered challenged. The impact of exposure to a toxin like lead causes a 5-point drop in IQ across a population. This shift results in a 57% increase in the number of children who are challenged, from 6 million to 9.4 million. There is a corresponding decrease in the number of children that are gifted, from 6 million to 2.4 million. Little shifts matter. The impact of exposure to another toxin, like flame retardants, results in a further increase in the number of children who are challenged, from 9.4 million to over 11 million. There is a further decrease in the number of gifted children. So one of the challenges is that as this shift continues, you can see that more and more children, right? Because it's the bell shape, the larger part of that bell-shaped curve is being shifted downward. And so there's almost like this magnified impact as exposures increase. The other thing we know is that in most communities, children aren't only exposed to one toxic chemical like lead, they're oftentimes, if not almost always, exposed to 3 or 4 or more toxic chemicals: air pollution, secondhand smoke, PBDE type flame retardants, lead, mercury. The list just seems to go on, and we keep finding new ones because sadly, the way we find out whether chemicals are toxic is we let industries use grandfathered chemicals, or we allow them to emit these chemicals into the air into the water where children are exposed. And then it's the job of people like me to come along and ask, are these toxic? Well, there's a problem with this scenario, isn't there? Because by the time we figured out whether this new pesticide, like neonicotinoids, might be toxic, millions and millions of children have already been exposed. So there's some real challenges with the way we regulate, or I should say, fail to regulate toxic chemicals. Sorry. And then I just wanted to bring this back again because this is really quite remarkable. I said that, you know, when I was trained, this idea was widespread, that there were safe levels or thresholds for chemicals or metals like lead. And in 2012, the Centers for Disease Control came out and said there are no safe levels. And even down below what we can measure in children today, even 10 to 100 times lower than what we measure in children today, we can see damage to the forebrain of rodents that have been studied in a laboratory. So it's likely that we'll continue to find impacts at lower and lower levels. All right, well, there's decelerating can be steep and downward. It can also be steep and upward. So let's look at another example of a decelerating, in this case, exposure response curve. So air pollution, we now know there is no safe level of air pollution. Down to the lowest measurable levels, we see impacts from fine particulate matter, fine meaning below 2.5 microns in diameter. And I wanted to show a video just to kind of illuminate that a bit more. Here we go.
You probably know that air pollution is bad for your lungs, but did you know that it's a major risk factor for heart disease, the leading cause of death worldwide? We usually focus on diet or exercise to prevent heart disease, but we can't escape air pollution. It's all around us. The link between air pollution and death was established in a series of disasters around the world. On Friday, December 5th, 1952, stagnant weather trapped a thick sulfurous smoke from the coal furnaces in the city of London. Children and elders died at a particularly alarming rate. All told, 12,000 people died, half as many that died from aerial bombings in London during World War II. Air pollution has declined since then, but it still accounts for about 8% of all deaths in London. Air pollution isn't made up of one thing. It's a cocktail of toxic gases and particles. These minuscule particles are comprised of a complex mixture of carcinogens, sulfates, nitrates, elemental carbon, and toxic metals like lead and arsenic. It's hard to imagine the size of these particles. It helps to compare it with the width of a human hair or a grain of sand. The size of a particle has a big impact on its toxicity. Small particles, like those smaller than 2.5 microns, penetrate deep into the lungs and set off a cascade of systemic inflammation. Each of these particles is invisible, but collectively they create a dense, visible smog that is deadly. About 15% of all deaths in the world are from ischemic heart disease. That's when your heart literally suffocates. Let's look at how the different levels of PM2.5, measured as micrograms of particles per cubic meter, are linked with heart disease in 3 cities. In Vancouver, which has an average concentration of 7, 2 out of 100 deaths from heart disease are linked with airborne particles. In London, which has a concentration of 16, it's 15 out of 100. And in Beijing, which has a concentration of 56, 27 out of 100. Let's look at more cities around the world. Now we'll sort them by how bad the air pollution is, with the worst levels on the right. As the particle levels increase, the percent of deaths from heart disease rises sharply, even at levels below the World Health Organization guidelines. Surprisingly, the greatest increase is at the lowest levels of exposure. There is no evidence of a threshold or safe level of particles. No matter where you live, reducing the level of particles would reduce the number of people dying from heart disease. If we decrease particles around the world to levels found in Vancouver, we could prevent 3 million excess deaths every year. The first step to prevent heart disease is to identify the sources of toxic particles. The major sources are motor vehicles, industry, coal-fired power plants, as well as the use of wood, dung, and other fuels for cooking and heating. But they vary considerably from city to city. The key to protecting people is to produce less air pollution. We need to consume less, promote cleaner technologies, regulate sources of pollution, and redesign our cities. We need to expand public transportation and build paths for cycling and walking. We need to build schools, childcare centers, and neighborhoods away from highways and large roadways, and create more parks and green space. Just think about it. If every city around the world took these steps, we would be closer to fulfilling our right to a healthy environment.
So what about cancer-causing agents or carcinogens? Well, the way we regulate those is a little bit more protective. In this case, the model that's used is called the linear no threshold. So it's straight line, but there's an assumption that there's no threshold. So that is somewhat more protective. But even then, we are still finding some carcinogens, for example, like benzene, where this steep increase at the very lowest levels, which is where most of our exposures happen, there's this steep increase that is greater than linear. So even for benzene, we're not adequately being exposed. There's also been a similar pattern observed for asbestos and malignant mesothelioma. So there's evidence from both non-carcinogens like air pollution and lead and tobacco smoke, although obviously air pollution and tobacco smoke can also contain carcinogens as well as the carcinogens. So what all of these studies show is that for some of the most widely disseminated and well-studied toxic chemicals, there are no safe levels, which is contrary to what most of us learned and in conflict with the way we regulate toxic chemicals. Even once CDC declared lead was toxic down to the lowest levels, we have failed to act because we basically throw our hands up in the air and say we don't have enough resources, so we aren't going to do what it's going to take to protect children. Kirk Smith, a brilliant epidemiologist and a friend, said it's an extraordinary claim, this decelerating exposure response curve. It's an extraordinary claim, he said, and I don't think we have extraordinary evidence yet, but it's nevertheless an intriguing hypothesis. So this is one perspective, but let me offer a second one, and that is that 50 or 60 years ago, when it was decided that there were safe levels or thresholds, that was just a big assumption. We didn't have evidence for it. It was an assumption. Now, fast forward 50 or 60 years ago, we have growing evidence and considerable evidence that for some of the most well-studied toxic chemicals, there is no safe level or threshold. And so the question I think we should be asking is, when does the absence of evidence continue to drive regulations? Shouldn't the burden of proof now be pushed in the opposite direction, since the evidence has mounted already that for some of the most well-studied toxic chemicals, there are no safe levels? Shouldn't that evidence trump an assumption? Let me provide an example, a little more in depth, and that is for coronary heart disease. Now, we already saw coronary heart disease in the slide on air pollution, but in that slide, it was called ischemic heart disease. So these are synonymous. Coronary heart disease and ischemic heart disease are the same. So the first question I have for all of you is, has coronary heart disease risen, stayed the same, or declined over the past 5 decades? I can't see everybody. Let's do this. Let me stop sharing for a moment. And I'm going to go to gallery view for a minute. So if all of you can either raise your hand or I'm going to ask you to vote. Raise your hand. You can do it with your real finger, your real thumb. How many of you would raise your thumb to say that coronary heart disease has risen over the past 5 decades? How many people think it's risen? You see a number of thumbs. All right, how many people think it stayed the same? Nobody. How many people think it's declined? Bridget. Looks like Bridget. Okay, now let's go back to sharing. So the title of this, oops, sorry. The title of this part of my, sorry, that's what I get for trying to ask questions. The mysterious decline in coronary heart disease. Coronary heart disease has declined by 70% since its peak in the 1960s. The question is, why? Nobody really knows, but you'll find out in just a minute. So in 1970, by the mid-1970s, it was already clear there was a decline, and a conference that brought together over 80 experts from around the country was convened in Bethesda, Maryland, to try to understand. And they asked two questions. First, is the decline real? And if so, what caused it? They came up with all these possible reasons for the decline. Could be an artifact. It could be the more coronary cardiac units, or surgery, more surgery, or Medicare, less smoking, blood pressure control, and on and on. The director of that National Heart Institute, which became the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, Dr. Robert Levy, who had presided over that conference, said 3 years later, it should be evident to the reader that we had too many rather than too few possible explanations for the decline. In other words, it was clear they had no idea why it declined. In Britain, they compared the decline in the United States, the decline in number of deaths from coronary heart disease among men. They didn't study women very well back then. And you can see here that there is a decline over this 10-year period in the red line in the United States, but no change in Britain. And so Jeffrey Rose, who was an expert in cardiovascular epidemiology, said, in Britain, then, I can't read this with the pictures here, but in Britain, then, we are failing to prevent a preventable disease. It wasn't clear why, but both Levy and Jeffrey Rose both agreed that this decline essentially suggested that we could control this man-made disease. The decline in coronary heart disease epidemic in the 1970s, Levy said, strongly suggests that we can control and even eradicate modern civilized man's most serious killer disease. Well, despite those early optimistic calls for prevention, for the most part, over the last 40 years, we focused on treatment and very little on prevention. We'll get to that in a minute. So these are the familiar litany of risk factors for coronary heart disease. You probably could list most of them without thinking about them. Sex, obesity, smoking, diabetes, salt intake, physical activity, and genetic susceptibility. Perhaps what's most telling is the absence of toxic metals and airborne particles. Now, why would that be? Well, if we can focus on these risk factors, isn't that convenient? We just blame people for their lifestyle choices, and we don't have to do anything about air pollution or toxic metals that people are being exposed to, and for which they really can't control by themselves. So it's been kind of a convenient way to avoid dealing with some of the most important risk factors for coronary heart disease, these toxic metals and airborne pollutants. This is a meta-analysis. A meta-analysis you can think of as a study of studies. In this case, they had 37 unique studies that they looked at, 26 cohort studies or prospective studies where you enroll people and then follow them, and 11 case control studies, which are fixed in time. They had almost 350,000 participants. And what you can see here down on the bottom, let's just focus on lead for a moment, is they looked at whether there was evidence to show that lead was associated with cardiovascular disease, coronary heart disease, and stroke. And for lead, you can see it's associated with all three. Cadmium, they found to be associated with cardiovascular disease and stroke, somewhat associated as risk factor, but not quite as strongly with cadmium. And for arsenic as well, cardiovascular disease and coronary heart disease. Now, I can't say why we failed to really acknowledge these. Back in the 1880s, Dr. Lorimer found some evidence that that tradesmen with gout from lead exposure had evidence of arteriosclerosis, 1880s, and the evidence really increased dramatically during the 1980s. So this is not especially new evidence, but it was certainly ignored for quite some time. So what about lead and cardiovascular disease? Well, we know lead from laboratory studies, we know lead enhances the development of atherosclerosis because it inactivates nitric oxide. It inhibits the repair of the endothelium, that's the interior lining of the arteries. It impairs angiogenesis, that is the new growth of blood vessels, and it promotes thrombosis, clotting of blood. Those are the hallmarks of atherosclerosis. And that's what lead does in the laboratory. And yet no studies had calculated the number of cardiovascular deaths attributable to lead, especially at the levels that most of us are exposed to. So a few years ago, we decided to do this. Even though I mostly study child health, nobody was doing this and I couldn't convince anybody to do it. So we decided to do it. And we did a study, we did an analysis of a study called the NHANES mortality study. It's the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. It's a national study. Almost 15,000 adults had been followed for about 20 years. And during that time, about let me see, oh, sorry. I'm just trying to clear my screen a little bit and I'm not doing a very good job. Okay, there we go. About 18,000 people died. I'm sorry, 4,400 people died, 1,800 from cardiovascular disease, and almost 1,000 from coronary heart disease. The geometric mean blood lead of the participants was 2.7, so what we think of as being very low. We don't take workers out of the workplace until their blood lead levels are in excess of 25 microgram per deciliter, right? We're looking at evidence with an average of about 2.7, and the majority had blood lead levels below 10, but 20% above 5. And what we saw was very consistent. Again, one of these decelerating, in this case, dose response relationships, beginning at the very lowest measurable levels. In this case, it was 1 microgram per deciliter at the time when they were enrolled. A steep increase in the risk as blood and the risk of dying from coronary heart disease or ischemic heart disease began at the very lowest levels, and then it starts to plateau. Again, no evidence of safe level or a threshold. And you can see here, you really don't need to know all this stuff other than what we're looking at here is the hazard ratio. So we just looked at the ischemic heart disease mortality, the hazard ratio or a type of risk as blood lead levels increase from the 10th percentile to the 90th percentile, essentially a doubling. And we saw that same pattern, even a little bit larger for people with blood lead levels below 5, the level today considered completely safe or innocuous for adults. So let me just show you another quick video here. I got to figure out how to move these pictures. You can't see them maybe, but here we go. Here we go. So more than smoking, more than obesity, more than diabetes. And if we look at all-cause mortality, that is all types of deaths associated with lead, we estimated that it was responsible for about 400,000 avoidable deaths. That would make lead the third leading cause of death in the United States, and almost nobody talks about that. All right, well, this is a little hard to believe. And so I want to go back to Scotland, and we're going to look at the same ban that we saw before, a smoking ban in public areas. But now, instead of looking at non-smoking pregnant women, we're going to look at non-smoking adults. And what happened following the ban on smoking in public places among non-smoking adults? There was a 20% reduction in heart attacks. Wow, that's huge. And again, most physician groups that I talk with know little to nothing about these types of studies. It's been replicated many times around the world. Now we can look at, in this case, a measure of air pollution or cigarettes. And again, you see this same type of steep increase at the lowest levels of exposure, and then it plateaus. So a decelerating exposure response relationship. And now I want to just step back a little bit and say, well, let's look at what happened over the past century. First thing I want to point out is that heart disease, coronary heart disease, at the early part of the 1900s was very rare. Coronary heart disease did not arise because we live to be older. It arose because of the changes we made to our environment. Coronary heart disease, like lung cancer, like diabetes, like COPD, are man-made diseases. Let that sink in a minute. The leading causes of death and disease today are man-made diseases. Now that's really troubling because we're spending all of our resources trying to treat or find cures for these man-made diseases, all the while we cause them by changing our environments. The hopeful part of that is that if we made them, we can prevent them. We have the potential to prevent them. So the other thing I wanted to point out from this is just the trends. Now we couldn't distinguish different types of heart disease until mid-century, but what you can begin to see here is that as we measured it better and better, coronary heart disease makes up the bulk of heart disease. It peaked in the late 1960s. Let's look at what else happened during the same time period. Looking at lead in teeth, you can see the peak of the lead pandemic was in the 1960s. It began to increase first in the early part of the 1900s and took off. This is on a lead in isotopic lead in teeth found in people of different ages. But you can see this basically has the same pattern as what we're seeing with this trend in coronary heart disease, with smoking. And it's also worth pointing out that it's really hard to separate out lead and air pollution because up until the 1980s, they were essentially the same. Air pollution was leaded. And even today, we find lead at very small particles in air pollution. So let's go back to Britain again. So you remember this slide? Rates of coronary heart disease deaths were coming down over this time period, but they didn't change in Britain. Well, why is that? We're here now just focused on the US. You can see that blood lead levels were coming down during this time period, and coronary heart disease was coming down as well. In Britain, they didn't remove lead from gasoline until the mid-1980s, and thereafter we began to see blood lead levels come down and coronary heart disease deaths come down. We can even look more specifically at lead and hypertension in the United States. And here you can see a national survey in Haynes done between 1976 and 1980 is here, and here 1988 to 1994. So this is looking at hypertension. The thing to pay most careful attention to is 1 in 3 adults had hypertension during this 4-year period, 1976 to 1980, and it had fallen to 1 in 5, to 20%. That's huge. So what happened during that decade? Well, investigators have looked at this to try to understand this mysterious and precipitous decline in hypertension. They looked at smoking, treatment for hypertension. They looked at obesity, which actually obesity was on the rise, so that clearly didn't explain it. And none of those explain this precipitous decline in hypertension. But what we found is that if you look at the precipitous decline here in hypertension, it's mirrored by the decline in blood lead levels. Now, this hatch line indicates no measurements were available, but you can see almost the same kind of tooth-like pattern, suggesting that lead is is acutely associated with an increase in blood pressure. Now, in contrast to that, this is something I found a few years ago on the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute's website. They took it down after I called them on it. The gain in longevity has been remarkable. Between 1970s and 2005, the life expectancy of the average American has increased by 6.6 years. 4.7 years, over 70% of the increase is due to reductions in deaths from cardiovascular disease. We can attribute this remarkable improvement in large part to NIH research. Maybe not. What do I conclude from this research? Heavy metals and air pollution, or heavy metals in air pollution, were the mysterious culprits of the rise and decline in coronary heart disease. That doesn't mean that other factors like cholesterol don't play a role, but the rise and decline, it appears to be driven primarily by heavy metals and air pollution, or heavy metals in air pollution. All right, let's see what time we have. It's 5:44. I'm going to skip this, but I'm going to make this video available to you, which basically shows that if we want to prevent disease, we really have to focus on population strategies. And if we have time or you want to come back and watch it and talk about it, we can do that, but I'm going to skip it for now. Basically, the idea is that we have 2 complementary but distinct strategies to protect our health. The first is, you know what, I'm going to play it because I'm telling you now about it.
Bruce, there's no sound, so you just have to do the, maybe the audio box thing in the corner.
Yeah.
Sometimes I forget to do that too.
I think I had that, but it's not working, huh? Let's try it again and see if it worked. Did you hear that? All right. Well, I guess it wasn't meant to be. I should have just stopped while I was ahead. So the clinical strategy is basically what we see in the United States today. Put most of our money into finding new drugs, into medical care, into this never-ending search for cures. That's the clinical strategy. And it has a role, right? We're always going to be sick. There's always going to be a need for that medical care. The problem is that we put 95% or more of our health dollars into medical care and too little into prevention. Over 96% of our research dollars go towards treatment. Very little goes towards prevention. And what we're beginning to find, this was a study that we did in 2017, the Lancet Commission on Pollution and Health. We estimated that 16% of all deaths worldwide were from pollution. With this new study we did on lead, it's likely to increase to over 20%. And even with that, we know this is a dramatic underestimate because it's so hard to measure pollution in so many countries around the world. So we're failing to protect people from pollution. And these premature deaths from pollution combined exceed deaths from HIV, tuberculosis, and malaria. And the amount of money directed towards pollution is dwarfed by these other conditions. So we need to begin to think differently about how we protect the public. So just a few conclusions. For a given exposure, toxic chemicals and pollutants may have greater effects or steeper increases in risk at the lowest levels of exposure, which may seem counterintuitive, but provides us with opportunities to prevent disease in ways that we didn't know we had. These steeper effects certainly pose regulatory challenges, but they also provide tremendous public health opportunities. Without any more studies on genetics or stem cells, for example, we could take steps based on evidence we have today and dramatically reduce the number of deaths and diseases from recognized hazards. And finally, these studies reinforce the importance of population strategies, which is that video you couldn't hear, that focus on protecting low to moderate risk groups, not waiting until people get sick in the first place. And just to quote Jeffrey Rose, who asked, why is so much of our research devoted to the mechanics of dying and so little to the scientific, social, and economic basis of prevention? So I'll leave you with that quote and that, let's just open it up for questions and comments. And we can either do those from the chat or we can do them directly. And I'm going to stop sharing.
Anybody have questions for Dr. Lamphere? If you do, just open up your mics and go ahead and ask him questions.
I have a question, and I'm hoping that Mary and Nadira and other community people will have questions too. My question is, when the EPA delisted Operable Unit 1 in our site, which is the residences, they used an action level of lead of 400 parts per million and arsenic of 70 parts per million. Do you think that is protective of human health?
And was this for soil, Bridget?
Soil.
The 400 part per million hasn't changed much over the past several decades. We have new evidence that shows that much of that lead is being is bioavailable. It's not sitting there in the soil inert. So no, it's not adequate. And I think the real challenge for us today is to both hold the EPA accountable to new science and advocate for more resources and a stronger mandate for them. So it's this interesting, an interesting position. Hold them accountable and then demand that they get more resources and a stronger mandate.
So following up on that, just one quick question. The Denver Water and Denver Public Schools is using 15 parts per billion as an action level for lead in school drinking water. Do you think that's protective of human health?
15 part per billion is not. I thought, and I'd have to go back and double check this, Bridget, but I thought Denver Health had taken a much more stringent stand than that.
Denver, not Denver Health, Denver Water.
Denver Water, okay.
Denver Health may very well have, but Denver Water, who is the provider.
Yeah, so Denver has taken a strong stand on lead service lines. Is that correct? That's my understanding.
Well, they have said that they're going to replace them. I think they have like 20 or 30 years to do it.
Yes.
And the copper and lead rule changed, and they are making progress, but still 100,000 homes have lead pipes.
Right.
So we still have, but I'm also concerned about the lead in schools.
Yes.
15 parts per billion through faucets and other, drinking fountains and so forth. So children are going to school drinking lead-laced water.
Right, absolutely. No, 15 parts per billion is absolutely not protective. We need to very quickly bring that down below 5. In the short term, bring it down below 5 parts per billion. And in the long term, we need to have a strategy that will bring it down to less than 1 part per billion. I should say that the lead and copper rule that was put out there under the Trump administration is being revisited under this new administration. There's an opportunity to demand that we take better actions. The administrative levels are still inadequate that they proposed. So there's probably another few months where we really need to demand that the EPA come out with a scientifically based lead and copper rule, not one that's based upon what's convenient. Other comments or questions?
I have a question. If there's, I don't want to jump the line. Do you know if the metals and say lead are bound in plasma, bound to plasma proteins?
Well, with lead in particular, probably about around 90% is bound to red blood cells, and then about 10% or so, it varies person to person a bit, is in plasma. So kind of, we think of that maybe the more biologically active, or where it goes from the red cell and then might be picked up and stored in the bone. So that's an approximation. I don't know for some other metals, but that's what we've estimated. That's what others have estimated for lead.
And then has anybody ever measured salivary lead or salivary metals?
I know there was some work being done to develop test kits where you could measure lead in either saliva or even in the interstitial fluid, like you could put a patch on somebody's arm, and based upon the very minuscule amount that leaches out between skin cells, there's no question it's there. The question is, can we measure it? But yeah, it will be there.
But that, yeah, I mean, I'm thinking of collecting samples at home and sending them in, rather than having, if at any time they wanted to do a mass measurement of different neighborhoods, it would be so much easier to give somebody a bundle of tubes or one, collect them throughout the day or throughout the week, and then just send them all in and measure them that way, rather than, it would be easy, and I think you get a better response, but I don't know if it's ever been done. So
it's still in sort of the experimental phase of, could we do it? It's not been developed so we can measure it down, and probably part of that is because it'll be there in smaller concentrations.
Yeah.
But it very well could be in the next 10 to 20 years. I don't think there's been enough investment in that type of technology, but there's been some work in that area.
Yeah.
There was a question I saw in the chat.
You got it?
Yeah, is lead filtered out of donated blood? No, and one of my colleagues, Cynthia Bear, has been working on this maybe 20 years, never got much traction. And she was particularly concerned about premature babies, newborns, because oftentimes as premature babies, they go through complete transfusions 2 to 3 times very early in life. And so she was concerned about lead. To my knowledge, it's not done at all. I'm not even familiar with questions being asked of people before they donate. I would also say, and of course, this is making people uncomfortable, I'm sure. It's not just lead, of course. We can measure dozens, hundreds of chemicals in all of our blood. And as far as I'm aware, none of it is being studied, whether it's forever chemicals like PFAS or lead or DDT. We just assume, and it's almost like we just don't want to know, right? Because it raises questions. Well, what would we do? Firefighters in particular, we're concerned about, because they've used firefighting foams that contain large amounts of this PFAS chemical or substances. And oftentimes they'll have very high concentrations. Well, firefighters are often some of the most friendly donors as well. Well, what do we do with that, right? I mean, it raises lots of troubling questions about some of the social agreements we have.
I have a question for Bruce.
Go for it.
Hi, we've communicated by email before. Gary Keller here from San Diego. I put in the chat room that 72% of all lead emissions, new lead emissions, come from general aviation aircraft. And in the Colorado, it's 20,931 pounds to be exact. What is your position as far as this lead that's coming from general aviation aircraft? And how do you feel about it as far as how it affects people around the airport?
Yeah, it's an urgent problem. Thanks for your question. We've ignored it for far too long. Early on, I suppose it was understandable why we ignored it. It seemed like such a small part of what led to airborne lead. But with the elimination of leaded gasoline in motor vehicles, it's become more and more important. And it's harder and harder to ignore, but we're still doing a pretty good job of ignoring it for the most part. I was quite disappointed when I reviewed the recent report from the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine that, number one, they had nobody on the committee that represented affected communities. And it seems to me that it's no longer adequate to have representation from the aircraft industry, the petroleum industry. They did have one person from public health, but for the most part, they didn't have any representing the affected communities. It's really urgent that we find ways to deal with this. In addition to the fact that we know children who live closest to the airports, and it's not just children. You heard some of the other evidence on heart attacks, for example. Those who are in the flight path, the exposures increase with the volume of traffic. So we know kids are being exposed. We know people are being exposed, but we know kids, especially because since we don't have adequate air monitors around the country, we inadvertently, I suppose, rely on children as airborne monitors of lead. And we know from those studies that have been done by Sammy Zarin and Mary Lynn Miranda and their groups that these exposures are consequential. We need to do something about them urgently.
Dr. Sammy Zarin's study will be coming out in the next 2 weeks, and we're all looking forward to it, actually across the globe, for general aviations that are having a negative impact on communities. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
There's a question from Weston Wilson. Do you want to ask that, or shall I just read it out?
Oh, I can ask it. Can you hear me?
Yeah, please, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on what Dr. Lampier is saying. If there's no safe level, for example, there's no safe level of benzene, the regulator's response is simply, let's do better. Let's try to reduce it. They will take no effort to get it eliminated or to get it to a point where it doesn't cause health risks. So is that, take it, Dr. Lampier, why you say it's going to take new law?
Yeah, well, I think it's going to take new law for a number of reasons. And thanks for the question. It's a great question. I think part of it is that the dominant belief today, when we think about our health, is that the way to improve our health is to invest in new medicines, genetics, medical devices, right? That's, whether you believe that or whether I believe that, that's the way our society makes investments. And until we step back and say, wait a minute, that's not the solution. We need to find ways to prevent disease in the first place. And that's predominantly by looking at environmental influences, broadly defined, including benzene. And genetics play a role in that, of course, but as long as we continue to study the role of genetics in isolation, we will fail to protect people's health, right? Because I already mentioned this, most of the diseases that kill us today are man-made. They've risen too quickly to result from shifts in the genetics of humans. So as long as we continue focusing on treatment, we're not going to get where we want to go. So why is it I think this gets to the crux of what you're saying. Why is it that instead of taking the bull by the horns and saying there's no safe level of lead, there's no safe level of benzene, there's no safe level of air pollution, our regulators basically say, well, if we reduce the PM 2.5 standard from 15 to 12, we can prevent 10,000 deaths. Well, obviously that's important, right? But where the vast majority of deaths are happening is even below 12. So here's the dilemma I think that the EPA or our government has. The government has two conflicting goals. The first goal is to protect its citizens. I have no question that they want to do that. They'd like to do that. But then got this other one, which is it appears to be overwhelming to do so. It would what would we do tomorrow to get rid of air pollution, to bring it down close to zero? Well, we can't. And so the government wants to appear that they're protecting us. And the only way they can do that is by saying, well, if we just inch it down, everything's cool, everything's fine, everybody's happy. But it's not true. Now, there are some alternatives. Think back to how we dealt with phasing out leaded gasoline. It was done over 2 decades, 2.5 decades. We could acknowledge, our government, our regulators, our public health agencies could acknowledge that there's no safe level of lead, there's no safe level of air pollution or benzene, and we're taking that seriously. And here's how we're taking it seriously. We're putting this amount of money to get rid of the lead service lines. We're putting this amount of money to get rid of fossil fuel reliance. We're getting this amount of money, but it's going to take us 10 or 20 years. I think most of us would be fine with that. I would be fine with that, even though I know there's some degree of risk that they can't eliminate tomorrow. So I think these are some of the challenges. And I think part of it is until the public rises up and says enough, I don't think we're going to get the kind of action that we hope.
Bruce, I kind of want to tie it in. We have a question in the chat by one of our members, Fran. Isn't government filled with big business people who only want to make a profit on what problems are addressed? Maybe it might be useful to kind of have a bit of a little bit of conversation about and demystify how did all these numbers come up in where did they get them from? Are they like pulling them out of the air? Like maybe demystify a little bit of the process of how it came to be, and because this might actually talk about some of the actors that were a part of influencing that decision.
Okay.
Thank you.
So, yeah, you bet. And I'll speak to lead because I know it best. And I think the main thing I've learned from lead is most of the standards or regulations were driven by what was thought to be feasible to achieve more than the science. So let's start with paint and lead. So back in 1976, it was clear that lead paint was toxic, was a hazard to children. The evidence really wasn't clear what was safe. So they opened up a bunch of cans of paint, of house paint. And they found that about a third of them or so were below 600 part per million. So they knew it was feasible. So that's what they chose, 600 part per million. Now, it did actually help to reduce the allowable levels of lead in paint and reduce lead poisoning. But that essentially is what's happened since then. So the first study I did as a young scientist was to ask what levels of lead in house dust were dangerous for kids, right? That's a measure of lead in the dust. Could be from paint, it could have been from track-in, it could have been from gasoline, but what levels were associated with children being lead poisoned? And first we had to design the method to collect it. So we compared 3 methods. We found the baby white method was pretty good. The white method was pretty good. And in 1996, we said, based upon the EPA's own definition, that is fewer than 5% of kids will have a blood lead in excess of 10 microgram per deciliter. We said that dust lead levels on floor should be less than 5 or 10 microgram per square foot, micrograms of lead per square foot of dust. That was 1996. right? We said 5 to 10. In 2001, the EPA set it at 40 microgram per square foot. And at 40 microgram per square foot, based on our data, we said 1 in 5 kids would be lead poisoned, not 5%, 1 in 5. So they misrepresented the data. Why? I think they were afraid that it wasn't achievable. So they let their perception of feasibility drive the standard more than the science. They continued to allow that to happen. The Sierra Club and some others, I think I saw somebody from the Sierra Club, sued them in 2016 in a federal court, the Ninth Circuit. The 3 judges forced them to revisit it. And in 2000, I might get my years wrong, I think it was 2018, they lowered it down to 10 microgram per square foot on floors, which might have been protective back in 1996. But since then, of course, the CDC and the EPA agreed, said there's no safe level of lead in blood. So 10 microgram per square foot is no longer safe. Earth Justice took them back to court, and the judges said, you must follow the science. We'll see what happens. Now they've got to come out with a new standard. There's no time window. But if they have to follow the science, the dust lead levels should be absolutely below 5 microgram per square foot, probably even 2.5 microgram per square foot. And if they're thoughtful about it, then they will say that over time it needs to come down even further. So it's really been driven more by feasibility, what's perceived to be feasible, than the science in most cases for lead. And my guess is that's true for many of the toxic chemicals and pollutants that are, I have some evidence from some of the others, but it's what's perceived to be feasible. Now, part of what's perceived to be feasible, somebody pointed out the issue of profit, is driven by industry, right? So when they said, they set the standard at 10 microgram per square foot because they had evidence that 70% of HUD grantees could get it below that, we sent them comments and a study, a published study that said in 100% of cases, we got it below 5 microgram per square foot. So they knew they could get it below 5, but they may have pressures from industry saying, don't go that low, don't go that low, or maybe it's just their own perception.
And would you, in the state and the federal guidelines, I mean, we know that states can be more stringent, right?
Yeah.
California being one of our most stringent. And so it should go to 0, but your point is well taken. It's about what is feasible. And I really found it interesting what you were talking about. I think this is really useful for a lot of folks here about how to actually get the dial moved. Is we have to be extremely proactive, and we have to engage the change, which is it's like you said, like they're not even bringing in community members, and there's not the people from the affected areas, and so there's definitely some bias and lack of access for a lot of people, and just being able to have input or even to understand the science.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, what, this really, as a scientist, flummoxed me for many years. Why isn't it that we aren't seeing more progress? And after having moved to Canada, I began to realize why. The real challenge right now is that the United States is being run like a corporation by the mega corporations, right? So the reason we have such a fragmented but highly profitable health system is that it's good for industry. So if you accept that, then a lot of the policies make sense. We could wipe out poverty tomorrow. Poverty is not inevitable. If we gave people a living wage, 95% of people would no longer live in poverty. It's a man-made problem, just like so many of the diseases. So if you accept that one idea that the mega corporations, and I'm not talking about the little guys, the mega corporations are running the United States like a corporation, right? They're the majority shareholders. As US citizens, we're minority shareholders. The only way we're going to change this is if enough of the minority shareholders get together and say enough. And whether that's about the living wage or whether that's about toxic chemicals and pollutants, I think that's going to be what it takes, because those majority shareholders are so powerful and have a vested interest in keeping things the way they are.
I believe Joan
Joan,
has a question. Go ahead,
Joan,
Joan.
unmute yourself, Joan.
What do I have to do to speak up here?
Dennis,
I don't
Joan's
know
going to
how
ask
to-
a
I don't know
question
how
and
to
then we'll
put-
follow up with you.
I don't know how to put it in the chat.
That's okay.
That's okay. We'll follow up with you after Joan, okay?
I just have an observation.
Go ahead, Joan.
Dr. Lamfer, I was exposed at Rocky Flats. I don't know if you recall Rocky Flats, a nuclear weapons facility, bomb making facility. And it brought me to begin to question, how did this happen? How did the community not know what was going on about the pollution and Superfund sites, et cetera? So this is unique because we are in a Superfund site situation in what you presented tonight. And the one thing, do you remember the name Theo Colburn?
Yes.
Theo Colburn jumped at me one time and said, don't you understand? Risk assessment is the issue. Risk assessment is the tool of the attorneys. And I thought, what is she talking about, right? And so it's come to this point in my involvement with trying to understand this serious situation we're in, even with this operable unit, that this particular community that we've been learning about is involved with more than just one chemical, lead or arsenic. That the community has asked these questions for over 20 years. We are living next to a freeway. We have industry that is not in control of their toxic emissions because they don't have standards for the 189 chemicals coming out of Suncor, let's say, or major industry that this particular operable unit in this Vasquez Boulevard Superfund site. And the reason I bring it to your attention is that it brought me to, we're dealing with multiple chemicals here, just like PFAS, we're dealing with multiple chemicals. EPA would not respond to this community. 20 years ago, they've been fighting this particular Superfund site, OU1, 2, and 3. And they have been exposed to multiple chemicals. And when you see that our agencies, EPA, NRC, the Ag Division, the Natural Waste Division, the Natural Environmental Division of our state, on and on, that we're dealing with multiple chemicals. And you know the name Dr. Samuel Epstein, and that was my first introduction. Like, what do you mean the politics of cancer? Mm-hmm. And so the general public, living close to Rocky Flats, the general public, was questioning, well, wait a minute, we're breathing plutonium, we're drinking plutonium at Stanley Lake, blah, 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 multiple chemicals. And you were right. They say, well, don't you understand? Your way of life would be different if we really had to tell you the truth about all these multiple chemicals. So cumulative risk assessment has been agreed to in this community. The Colorado Department of Transportation, the Federal Highway Authority, arguing with the EPA, saying, why didn't you set up chemicals for these 189 chemicals? Or why didn't you set up auto emissions, diesel emissions? This community has no clue that they are being exposed to unregulated chemicals with the autos, unregulated chemicals with Suncor, unregulated chemicals with water and soil. In this Superfund site, they chose smelters where it's just a little arsenic and a little lead. So that's kind of where we're at. A lot of us are saying, wait a minute, the EPA does not do cumulative risk assessments. And so they said, we'll just look at epidemiology. Well, epidemiologists, they look at what are the standards? What are people being exposed to? So I just wondered what you thought about cumulative risk assessments that EPA doesn't talk to very much. And I think that's a big clue for all of us now, is to understand you were right. They're not telling us the truth about cumulative exposures.
Yeah, well, and certainly not incorporating more than one chemical at a time, and in some
Right.
cases, not even considering cumulative risk assessment for the same chemical or toxic metal. It is a challenge, and I think what you've really addressed, Joan, is this this assumption that these levels are acceptable to whom, and why are they acceptable? We have said that a certain amount of disease is okay. That is, we put industry over human health. Now, at some point, we have to decide not whether technologies are worth it, but what technologies are worth it. We can be selective. We can try to choose some technologies. We've been told by the chemical industry, for example, that the reason we live longer is because of chemistry. It's not true. For the most part, it has to do with these population strategies I was talking about. So we have to begin to ask questions in more nuanced ways. We've got to figure out how to break that transfusion of money from the big corporations to our elected representatives, because until we fix that, we're not going to go anywhere very far. So I think we basically have to start pushing and say that we need to value human health to a greater extent over industry health, over corporate profits. And that's going to take some time. But, I think we'll get there, but it won't be without the community input. So somehow we've got to find a way to amplify the voices of mothers who are concerned about their kids, amplify the voices of community members who are concerned about the health of their community, and not continue to allow these industries, who have big purse strings, of course, to get away with amplifying their voices over all of the rest of the voices.
Bruce,
Why don't-
one last thing
yeah.
was I just learned about, I ignored it. I ignored Dear Bridget when we were talking about PFAS. And so I started researching recently. Oh my goodness. And what I was concerned about was finding out in Colorado, we have Buckley Air Force Base with 205,000 parts per trillion of PFAS in the groundwater that the military has known for years, didn't tell anyone, didn't tell the EPA. So you're right, we can say industry, but we're talking, there's bigger players here than industry. We had, the Pentagon, and we had the military, both Army, Navy, Air Force. I'm an Air Force brat. And I think Rachel I just found out she was living where in England, they had a nuclear accident. And that one shocked me. So I'm just saying, the picture's real big, and you're right. So anyway, I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, thank you. And
Dennis.
Dennis.
Joan, Dennis, oh, sorry, did you want to?
Dennis.
It's so easy to forget me. That's okay. Don't
No,
worry.
it isn't. Get
No,
out
it
of
is
here.
I just want to say that my family is a witness to your testimony today, Doctor, because my grandfather was on the railroad and no real railroad engineer wore the gas mask. My father was a Denver firefighter and no real firefighter wore the gas mask. So both of them spent the last few years of their lives in nursing homes, unable to walk because they couldn't get enough oxygen to their bodies. So, but there's enough interest in the councilmanic races and mayor's race that's coming up, and the House and Senate. I hope everybody on our program tonight will mention this to everybody who's looking at running for any of those offices, and not let them get away with it. And the District 4 Democrats just had their picnic at Barnum Park, and I don't think I heard anything about any of this. And so we have to be the mouthpieces for the neighborhood. So I just wanted to add that as a little coda here to our evening. And Joan is always so eloquent, I feel inadequate following her. So.
Oh, Dennis.
So one of the things I took away from your point, Dennis, and I think it's right on track, and that is if we follow up that analogy of the minority shareholders, enough of the minority shareholders have to begin to appreciate and recognize that they and their family and loved ones and communities have been impacted by toxic chemicals, are being impacted by toxic chemicals, because there's so much else to be distracted about in this world. And some of that probably is intentional.
Okay, well, thanks for letting me pipe up.
Thank you.
Can I ask a very short question?
Oh, go ahead.
A brief overview of, well, not overview, just a connection between lead and ADHD, lead and autism.
Yeah. We've got a nice new video out that we just did for, can I show it? Do I have a minute?
If you got, yeah, if you got it.
It'll take me just a second to find. So lead and autism have been linked for, at least with a rodent study, for over 40 years. Ellen Silvergeld was doing a study trying to understand how lead caused palsy of the wrists in workers, and found that even at relatively low levels, she was finding that the mice that she exposed to lead were hyperkinetic. They just couldn't sit still. And she told her sister about this, and her sister, who worked with children who were developmentally challenged, said, well, what happens when you give them methylphenidate? That is the drug that we use to treat kids with ADHD. And so she tried that, and she found out that it worked. It made the mice stop running around. Then Herb Needleman did a study, one that we often think of as a seminal study, and showed that lead exposure measured in the teeth, this was a 1979 study, that homeroom teachers rated the children as much more likely to have all these problems that we now think of as ADHD. In a national study we published in 2009, we estimated that 1 out of 5 cases of ADHD in US children, about 600,000 cases, could be attributed to lead. Lead and tobacco combined, we estimated, accounted for 1 out of 3 cases, but we didn't get a lot of attention. This animation that I'm going to show you shows that, but it also shows something else we found that's kind of intriguing. Usually when we think about toxic chemicals, the impact they have on behaviors, we sort of think that it shifts the entire distribution. Well, what we found with lead and phthalates are the example in the second part of the animation when we look at autistic traits, is that phthalates made children who already were mildly autistic somewhat more autistic. So let me just show you that, and I hope you'll see what I mean. Oh, that's not the right one. Hold on a second. All right, here. I hope that hang on a second. I hope that you can hear the volume. Share screen, optimize. All right, how's this? You see that? Hear that? No,
No,
I don't know what's going on.
Severe, they may be diagnosed with a behavioral
they
problem,
are.
such as ADHD.
You heard that?
Yeah.
Well, I wonder what I did. It was only after I shut off the share.
Well, turn it on again.
Share screen. I'm going to not try to optimize it and see what happens. All right, you can see that.
Yeah.
Let's see what happens.
In one study,
There you
we found
go.
that the average number of ADHD
Okay, here we go.
When scientists study how exposures to toxic chemicals alter children's behaviors, they usually measure behaviors of typical children. When children's behaviors are severe, they may be diagnosed with a behavioral problem, such as ADHD. In one study, we found that the average number of ADHD behaviors increased as the amount of lead in children's blood increased. The percent of children with ADHD more than doubled from 5 to 13%. In contrast, in a study on autism, the number of autism-related traits didn't increase in the typical child as their in utero exposure to phthalates increased. But children who already had autistic traits developed more autistic traits as their exposure increased. And the percent of at-risk children increased from 0 to 2.5%. We can't always predict which children will be affected by toxic chemicals. So to protect the few, we have to protect everyone.
So we saw the same thing with lead that we saw with phthalates that was shown in the second part of that video, that children who already had some autistic traits or more autistic traits, when exposed to higher amounts of lead, developed even more traits consistent with autism. Whereas with ADHD, it sort of shifted the entire curve.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions? Please.
Could you, Bruce, would you comment on fracking? We have in Colorado fracking 500 feet from houses.
Yeah, I think I was asked this last time and I said the same thing. One of my favorite compliments was, I know my limits. So I think this was when I suggested you talk to John,
Adgate.
Thank you, John Adgate, who's done a lot of that research, and I haven't done much. So I like, at least when I'm in my scientific outfit, if I don't know something or haven't studied it, I can give my opinion on anything, but I like to limit it to when I feel like I know something and I've studied it. So I don't know. Ask John.
Oh, Joan, go ahead.
Joan, turn your mic on. Unmute. There you are.
Thanks, Adrian. Bruce, you're doing some research on PFAS right now. And the reason I'm bringing it up, it was just, as I said, it was fascinating to watch the public now begin to say, wait a minute, it's in my drinking water, it's in my clothes, it's in wastewater, it's in the zoos. And so I wondered, are you doing research on PFAS?
Yeah, I'm doing some. We've looked at childhood exposure, and in the birth cohort I started in Cincinnati, we were surprised to find that they had levels of PFOA that were twice the national average. They were in Cincinnati, and we weren't sure why, but what we found out is because the drinking water of children in Cincinnati and pregnant women, actually it was in pregnant women where we saw it, is 250 miles downriver from the C8 plant. So what have we found? Well, one of the things that we found is that PFOA looks like an obesogen. That is, the babies are born a little smaller than expected, and then there's this kind of catch-up growth. So we've seen this with tobacco. People have seen this with tobacco, tributyl-10, PFOA, that there are these chemicals out there that are obesogens. And PFOA and some of the other PFAS chemicals also appear to be disrupting our cardiometabolic health. We're just beginning to study thyroid status. They're thyroid disruptors. And then I'm part of a study in Australia looking to see whether if we take firefighters and randomly assign them either to be controls or to have platelet donations or whole blood donations, whether we can reduce their PFAS burden over 12 months. That should be out in the next year or so.
Pretty serious.
Yeah, I think, Joan, I think the real challenge is, we've already talked about the fact that there's all these chemicals. The other one is, how do we maintain enough attention on all of these chemicals that we finish the job? We're still dealing with lead, and it was recognized easily 100 years ago, 120 years ago. And even after we ramped up policies in the 1980s to reduce it, we're still dealing with lead. And now, of course, we're dealing with dozens of other chemicals. And, what tends to happen is we put out a couple, flurry of activity, maybe a few regulations, maybe we throw some money at it, and then we move on to the next thing. But we don't necessarily finish the job. It's really hard, and it's going to take decades for any one of these.
I think it was the number of chemicals that are now, that started out with 4,000, then it went to 5,000. Now it's at 9,000 of the PFAS. And people should watch that movie, I guess, Dark Waters. And, there's your industries that have gotten caught, but the military hasn't been caught yet. And we know we were going to ask to have fish test. And there was a gentleman who's part of Military Poisons. He's got a website. He was declaring that the fish downstream from these military plants are so contaminated. Colorado doesn't do their own testing. And that's why I said, I think this is lead, absolutely. It's something to look at, but the PFAS has even shocked me as far as where we're at with that. And I think the public, they are asking now, what do you mean it's in my dental floss? What do you mean? I mean, it's that prevalent. And so that's why I wondered, you've been dealing with multiple chemicals, I'm sure, for your entire history. And it's now just shocked me to see that we've got this wonderful community that we really have learned with this Superfund site, that they have been exposed to the multiple chemicals that many of us haven't been exposed to. And Mary Hernandez, who's on this particular site tonight, has a story. And Mary, I don't know if you'd ever mentioned this to Bruce Lamphere, but it's just a shocking story as far as her lead exposure and the heavy metals, et cetera. And so anyway, thank you. I just wanted to thank you for being here. And that's where my head is at right now. It's just shocked at the multiple chemicals now that we're only looking at maybe 26 here in Colorado coming out of Suncor's, groundwater. And right now that particular Superfund, that particular site, the Suncor refinery, it's been around since the 30s. And so they're seeing, some PFAS coming off. So, but they're everywhere. And that's why I said, wow, how do you feel as a scientist to feel like people are beginning to wake up? What do you mean there's 9,000 chemicals uncontrolled and EPA is only going to look at 26?
Yeah. Well, I do think that's, it is an indication of hope that more and more people seem to be familiar with toxic chemicals, worried about toxic chemicals. And you can see it in different ways that more and more people, for example, are choosing organic. On the other hand, what's still troubling is that we really do keep inadvertently or otherwise putting the burden on families, right? Now people have to worry about whether there's pesticides in the food. Now they have to worry about PFAS or arsenic or lead in their water. And now they have to worry about the levels of air pollution. These are not things that families can do on their own. That's why we have an EPA. And again, it's challenging, but we need to both hold them accountable as well as to demand that they get more money and a stronger mandate so they can actually protect us better.
Bruce, don't you think a cumulative risk assessment would give the public an idea of the true nature of, just like at a Superfund site, we only get a chemical here and a chemical there and a couple of chemicals that they look at, when in fact EPA is aware that there's always been cumulative exposure, and that's why they didn't regulate the 189 chemicals from the Clean Air Act in 1990. Right.
Well, I think the scary part of that is that we have no idea how to do it. The EPA has no idea how to do it. It's just overwhelming to imagine what to do with it. And that's one of the other reasons I think it's just going to take a world view shift, that ultimately it's about, we need to just decide we're going to stop playing this whack-a-mole game and find ways to dramatically reduce all chemicals, all synthetic chemicals, certainly all chemicals that weren't found at the kinds of concentrations they are, like lead and mercury, even though they're elemental, they've always been there. It's going to take a big shift. And that's a different one than trying to do risk assessment on every single chemical or even a cumulative risk assessment, they will continue. It's kind of like, it's very much like what we were talking about with clinical strategies and population strategies. We can continue to use a disease model, i.e. risk assessment, or we can decide that we need to find ways to reduce exposures across the board. And I'm much more in favor of finding ways to reduce those toxic chemicals and air pollutants across the board. We'll still need to do some mop up. We'll still need to do risk assessments, just like we still need pills and treatments for people who are sick. But that should not be where we put 99% of our resources.
So I want to kind of finish up the evening with either our two of our affected community members, Mary or Yadira, if they have any questions or comments or final thoughts that they'd like to offer us, and also if there are any of our agency partners, if they have a question, they can put it in the chat and we'll get that covered for them as well. And I want to really thank you for being here and taking more time for tonight and away from your family, and we appreciate your patience and just answering questions. This is really useful for us, and we appreciate your accessibility. Thank you. Mary or Yadira?
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, Bruce, I went to a meeting that you had a year ago, 2 years ago now, and I was able to talk to you they gave me a chance to talk to you for about an hour after the meeting, which was so enlightening, and I thank you for what I've learned, and I thank you for tonight because I learned a little bit more, and sorry, so much going on in my family, but I'm grateful that you're doing this. And I was just going to ask you a question about lead testing on the kids. I mean, we were promised, I've been working with the group for about 5 years, and we were promised to get the kids lead tested. And would that even help to get the kids lead tested? I mean, they haven't done anything for us yet, but would it really help to get the kids lead tested in the neighborhood?
Yes, it might. But I think as important, and in some ways perhaps more important, is to make sure that the sources of lead exposure that are in the community are measured, identified, and controlled at the same time that children's blood lead is being measured. Because that really should be the focus of any public health effort, is reducing the exposure. Continuing to use children as biological indicators of contaminated communities and not adequately controlling the contamination is wrong.
Okay, so in other words, it's not going to help because they don't seem to want to do anything to help the people in the neighborhood, and there's no moving them out. So I just see what's happened to my family, and it's not been good. And I was going to ask another question. When you have lead in your body already, it's passed on through to the baby, right?
Yes.
When you're pregnant. Okay. Yes. Okay. I am going to have a great grandchild now, so I'm just kind of curious about what could be, what could happen to this great grandchild.
Yeah. It does. Having children, of course, raises lots of questions. We tried in some of our videos to provide some steps that families can take, and I think those are important, but they are interim steps. The ultimate strategy has to be reducing exposures in our environment and not continuing to put all the burden on families to protect themselves from these contaminated communities. That's where the EPA needs to be held accountable, and that's why they need our support at the same time. So there are some steps you can take. They're not always available to everybody. So I'd encourage you to look at that. I'm happy to talk to you more about those. And at the same time, we must continue to focus on the sources of exposure and demand that our cities, our counties, our states, our federal government cleans them up.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mary.
Yadira? Do you have any comments or thoughts that you would like to leave us with?
I don't. It's just shocking to hear all of the information that is given, you know, in some sort of way. It's like now you have an answer on why things are happening with your health or with your children's health. But the worst part is, you know, is like, even though we know and it's causing it and it's there, we're not going to be able to do a whole lot to change it, you know.
So one thing I would say, Yadira, is that we do have some good examples. The decline in blood levels, you know, I've been a little bit, I dismiss that as not enough, and that's true, but we do have good examples where we have seen change. We are seeing reductions in smoking. It's not fast enough, but lung cancer is coming down. We have seen declines in blood levels, not as fast as they should have, but they are coming down. We've seen declines in people dying from motor vehicles. Not enough. There should be zero. But there are successes. But where there have been successes, there have always been community movements. It has never been enough to just rely on public agencies, even as much as we all hope that that would be true. And so it will take time, but we will, maybe not for our children, maybe for our grandchildren, make the kind of shifts that are necessary. But it's going to take time, and it's going to take too long, unfortunately, but it will happen.
I know it's just unfair that we're all having to be sacrificed to all of this, you know, and it's sad because there's a lot of lives and a lot of pain and a lot of hurt, especially, you know, when all of this stuff that is happening is hitting you home with your family.
Yes. Yes, it is troubling.
That is, I mean, and Dr. Lempier, and also Chuck mentioned, like, environmental racism is real. It is absolutely real. And your zip code shouldn't determine your outcome as far as your health is concerned, your education, your life opportunities. It just that shouldn't be the way it is. I really appreciate everyone's thoughtful comments and questions. Please make sure you're a part of our newsletter so you'll get this information. And I can't imagine, I cannot express how grateful I am for this community. You all fill my cup often, and I appreciate that. So be careful getting home, and I will see you all later. Thank you.
Thank you for all you guys do.
Thank you, Dr.
Bye-bye.
Lempier.
Have a good night.
You too.
Thank you. Have a good night.